In our last episode, we packed up our roadside camp and we continued heading north along the west coast of this truly spectacular landscape. We'd been living in the Jeep and been on the road for almost 3.5 months now. A great deal of that spent in Norway for this very reason. The freedom of camping and the reminder that nature dominates is all around you, and it really is hard to leave. But there was another great wilderness on the horizon, and somewhere we wanted to be. And it was time to start making tracks northeast, towards Sweden, another wilderness country that we were just dying to get back to. At the end of the last episode, we packed up our lakeside camp in Voss and began a pilgrimage of sorts to visit the location where myself and Megan got engaged back in 2014 when we backpacked along the west coast. It didn't take us long to get there, and after a few hours of driving, we descended down a one-way road towards a village called Undredal. The road was built in the late 80s, and previously the only way to get to the village was by boat. We took a boat here on our previous visit, before hiking out the surrounding area and doing some wild camping. But before visiting the old locations where we camped, we decided to head into Undredal for a trip down memory lane. Undredal had a very small population of people and goats, and it was famous for its brown cheese, which had a very unusual sweet taste that was strangely addictive. It also had the smallest stave church in Northern Europe, and it was fairly popular for tourism. Our previous visit left us feeling like Undredal was a bit of a ghost town, as it was much earlier in the year, but with all this good weather, the campsite was almost full, and we decided to stay a night. They had a bar, live music, some attractions, even a restaurant. It was nice to have a bit of normality, have a drink, and just spend some time together in a different kind of environment rather than in the wilderness in the roof tent.
Hi, Ettu.
After some breakfast, we decided to get geared up and go for a hike, and we followed the river up to try and find the location where we wild camped back in 2014. And a few kilometres in, there was no doubt that we'd found the location, although obviously it looked a lot different due to the time of year. But there were still some things that gave it away almost immediately when we got there. A large boulder covered in moss, where I originally hid the ring under the moss, and called Megan over to help me build a shelter. We used this moss as our bed, and I remember carrying it off the rock and putting it under our tent. I'd never seen Megan go from exhausted to completely ecstatic in almost a split second, but hopefully it made her night when I proposed to her. It was one of the most comfortable nights we'd had, sleeping on that thick bed of moss. I found our old fireplace also. We spent a few days here, just enjoying the solitude, which was much of a contrast to back home. And I remembered us cooking our dinner on the rocks, namely sausages, goat meat and goat cheese was a lot of what we were eating. And there was also some marsh thistle growing in the area, and we'd use this as a substitute salad, as Megan was craving some fresh fruit and veg, and this was about all we had at that time. I was also using Anonotus obliquus, in other words chaga, a type of mushroom to make fire and also make us tea. We even found the very same tree that we harvested the chaga from. It truly was a special area for both of us, and it was about as far as our legs could take us at the time, given we'd been backpacking and we were both tired. I remember Megan's pack weighed over 40 pounds, and she never complained once, despite how far we had to walk. And maybe that's why I proposed to her at this very moment. It was good to see that the moss we slept on, that we returned to the boulder, was still going strong, and after a bit of lunch, it was time to head back down river to the Jeep and continue making some progress on our travels. As we left Undredal, we decided to pay a visit to another town we visited before, a town called Flom on the edge of the fjords. Small cruise ships would often leave from here to tour the fjords, and a train service operated here also, which made it very, very popular for tourism. On our previous visit, it was more like a ghost town, much like Undredal, and we spent most of our time up in the mountains where there was still snow, wild camping and just exploring nature. But this time round we met another traveller who offered to buy me a drink that he claimed was the strongest beer in the world, and he wasn't wrong.
Hey Mike, how drunk are you?
That beer was... He's bit 15%. It was pretty obvious that I was in no fit state to drive, so it was Megan's turn to take the wheel, although she really didn't enjoy driving the Jeep on the road, as there just seemed to be too much at stake for her. But there was one style of driving that Megan absolutely loved, and that's slow trails and off-roading. So as I tried to hold the camera steady, Megan navigated us to our next camp location, along some really interesting trails, and eventually she found the perfect spot. The camp location she found was almost definitely one of our all-time favourites. Although there was a mountain road nearby, it felt like you were miles away from anywhere, almost in another world, and all you could hear was a trickle of water in the background, and the wind cutting through the mountains and what few trees there were at this altitude. One major plus of places like this is fresh water. Like almost all of Norway, the water at this altitude is drinkable straight from the source, and is crystal clear provided there are no surprises upstream. Places like this were gems, especially when you've been on the road. Packing down and setting up every day can wear you down, so being able to stop and find a slice of heaven where you can spend a few days just to wind down, do your washing and just chill out is incredibly valuable. And much like many places we'd been, it was a very peaceful evening. There she is, the soldier. So this is why we chose a dry bag as a washing machine, because that is full of water. And we've had to walk to the river over there, or I say we, Megan has, to get all the water. And with a bucket, you'd have to carry it. So the dry bag doubles up as a day sack. It holds our dirty clothes, and we do the washing in it. We ended up staying in this location for 2 nights, and to date it still remains one of our all-time favourite spots, mainly just because of the atmosphere and how desolate it felt. But despite how comfortable we were here, it was time to leave. This way of travelling isn't very expensive. Once you have the vehicle kitted out and it's sustainable, all you really need is fuel for the stove, which lasts a very long time if you use it right, food and fuel, and the occasional expense on ferries if you intend to cross water. But despite all this, Norway is an extremely expensive country. Fuel not so much for us, as the Jeep was doing about 33 miles per gallon with its diesel engine, and we'd only filled up a handful of times in the entire month of being in the country. But food was very, very expensive, and even though we were working on the road doing leather commissions, we'd run out of stock and used all our supplies, so what we had was all we had. And it was running out. We had a destination in mind though, and we began heading eastbound towards the border of Sweden, but before getting there, we still had quite a bit of Norway to go through. And as per usual, Norway was not making it easy to leave, or to make any progress for that matter, as there was a lot of stopping to admire views. But in the distance we spotted an old service road, which sealed the deal for our next camping location, and instead of leaving such a beautiful place, we ended up staying there. It was a truly awesome camp location, and the 4-wheel drive just put the icing on the cake, as we were able to get off the service road and follow where other vehicles had been before us and get closer to the lake. But one thing you must understand about Norway is off-roading is completely illegal. The penalties are harsh. Throughout this entire series we've only driven where we can visibly see vehicles have been before us, on trails that are marked on maps and also visible on Google Earth. We've also sought local knowledge as we've travelled to certain areas to see what's doable and what's around and where we can go. And if you play your cards right, you'll find some truly stunning locations, much like this one. It wasn't long before we had camp set up. There was a cool breeze in the air, but it was still very dry, so it gave us the opportunity to hang some clothes out that were still a little damp from the last camp location. Whilst we were getting set up, we also had some visitors. A couple who were doing some travels of their own in their diesel-powered Rubicon had seen our videos and had come down the service trail to say hi, and after chatting to them and admiring their ride, they continued on with their travels, and we made some chili and rice with a bit of cheese, which was a welcomed meal after a very long day of driving. Although it wasn't long before the clouds of mosquitoes forced us up into the rooftop tent, where we abandoned our table and chairs, and we decided to call it a day and just enjoy the views of the mountains as we settled down for the night. One thing that takes a bit of getting used to when travelling in these countries in a tent is that it never truly gets dark, more so the further north you travel. But we'd gotten used to this by now, and we had a very good night's sleep that night, as the winds were low and it was incredibly quiet, and we always commented to each other of how well we sleep in the roof tent, compared to back home in a house. But as we were both feeling refreshed, we made sure we set off early, and we had to, as in Norway it seems to take you 10 times longer to get somewhere because of how stunning the scenery is. And it was just that. One thing we had to stop and look at was the glacial melt rivers that had suspended a kind of sediment, often referred to as rock flour, in the water, giving it a blue or grey colour, and the further down the river we went, the more intense and vibrant the greens were. It was almost like a sheet of glass, and in calm winds it reflected the mountains and the forests and made for an incredible picture. It was really nothing like we'd ever seen, and I'm pretty sure we'll never forget it. It wasn't long though before we started travelling up another mountain road, and we were heading towards Norway's tallest mountain, Galdhøpiggen, which was accessible via 2 base camps. The one we were heading to was called Spitterstulen, as the other one, which I can barely pronounce, required a guide to take you across a glacier before you could reach the mountain. But before we got there, we decided to take a lunch break by the side of a river. We had some lunch, and Megan snapped me out of my trance, and we carried on to the base camp, along a beautiful mountain road that followed alongside the river. It wasn't long before we reached the base camp, and it was pretty evident that this was a very popular place. They had a lot of accommodation, plus an enormous camping area, and you had to make sure you paid the toll for the mountain road, but it was also very inexpensive to camp if you did choose to stay here. They had maps and information about the hikes in the area, and a restaurant and shop if you wanted to stay and have food. But as keen as we were to do the hike, I was still nursing an injured ankle, so we swallowed our pride and put it back for the next time we visit, and we made our way back down the mountain road and carried on with our travels. As we descended down from the mountains, the topography of the landscape changed drastically. It was quite a contrast from the month we'd spent travelling Norway, as the fjords really do leave an impression on you. But before making our way to the border of Sweden, we made one last pit stop, and we even bumped into some subscribers and people we follow on Instagram who were doing something similar in some very impressive Mercedes G-Wagons. And once we were refueled, we set off with the border in mind. But there's one piece of the story we've left out so far, and something me and Megan had been talking about when we originally planned this trip. There was a reason we packed our lives up back home, sold everything, and all our worldly possessions existed in the Jeep. We had no intention of returning to the UK anytime soon, and this trip was more than just a holiday. It was about finding a new life, somewhere less crowded, with wilderness, where you lived within nature, and not on top of it. Somewhere that was more in line with a lifestyle that we've always tried to have together, and talked about the entire time we've been together. And this is why we were returning to Sweden. We'd previously been there in 2016, on an expedition with Husky Kennel Lapland. We fell in love with the area, and we always wanted to see what life was like there, and that's why we were making a beeline for Sweden, in the lower northerly part of the country. But that's where this part of the story ends, and the rest of it continues in the next episode. And from me and Megan, thanks again for watching, and we'll see you very soon.